Iran thought it had finally found the pressure point that could bring Washington to its knees, choke the Strait of Hormuz, strangle 20% of the world's oil and gas supply, and force the United States to back off or face a global economic meltdown. For a few terrifying weeks, it looked like the strategy was actually working. Tankers were stranded, insurance costs exploded, and vessel traffic through the strait collapsed by more than 90% as captains refused to sail into what looked like a kill zone. Tehran bragged that it had turned one of the world's most critical shipping lanes into a toll booth, deciding who lived, who starved, and who paid. But while Iranian commanders were busy flexing on cameras and threatening to fire on any ship that disobeyed, another war was unfolding hundreds of miles away, far from the headlines. Quietly, methodically, the U.S. was not just sinking Iranian ships. It was erasing the very industrial heart that Iran needed to keep its blockade alive. Before we break down exactly how this happened, we have a quick request. You are watching a brand new channel. Our dedicated team is working over 12 hours a day, every single day, without rest, to bring you the highest quality military analysis on YouTube. Our immediate goal is to reach our first 1,000 subscribers to monetize the channel and fund this research. If you want to support real tactical breakdowns, please hit that subscribe button. It means the world to our team. To understand why this blockade just backfired so brutally on Iran, you have to see the world the way Tehran saw it the day they moved to shut Hormuz. From their perspective, the numbers looked unbeatable. This narrow stretch of water is the only route for massive volumes of oil and liquefied natural gas leaving the Gulf. Close it, even partially, and you don't just hurt the United States, you shock the entire global economy. Almost overnight, daily vessel traffic through Hormuz plunged, with some maritime trackers estimating around a 95% reduction since the war with the U.S. and Israel began in late February. Oil prices shot above $100 a barrel, fuel rationing started in parts of Asia, and governments from Beijing to New Delhi quietly began calling Tehran, trying to cut deals just to get their tankers through. On paper, it looked like a masterstroke. Iran did not need to defeat the U.S. Navy in open battle. It only needed to make transit so dangerous, so unpredictable, that shipping companies would decide it wasn't worth the risk. The strategy was less about a classic naval blockade and more about weaponized uncertainty. Drones that could appear out of nowhere, missiles hidden along the coast, and fast attack boats ready to harass and board vessels under the cover of inspections. Iran's Revolutionary Guards declared the strait effectively closed to certain ships, while permitting friendly or strategically useful traffic through, a selective closure that turned Hormuz into a geopolitical pay-to-play corridor. Behind this move stood decades of investment into asymmetric naval power. Iran built fleets of small, fast boats, developed anti-ship missiles, and turned coastal positions into layered threat zones designed to terrify civilian captains and drive up insurance to insane levels. A 2017 U.S. report had already identified naval mines and harassment tactics as a critical component of Iran's playbook in the Gulf, and Tehran leaned hard into that reputation. To the Iranian leadership, this was their ace, a choke point they could switch off at will, watching markets crash while Washington and its allies scrambled. But there was a hidden weakness baked deep into this strategy, one that Iranian planners either underestimated or arrogantly dismissed. A blockade is not a slogan, it's a system. It requires ships, repair yards, dry docks, logistics, trained crews, and constant maintenance. All those nimble, fast boats, mine layers, and missile-equipped vessels don't operate in a vacuum. They depend on a physical backbone of steel, cranes, workshops, and engineers, especially in key complexes like the SADRA facilities around Bushehr and other marine industrial organization yards along Iran's southern coast. For years, SADRA had grown into one of Iran's leading shipbuilding and repair hubs, able to service commercial, military, and offshore oil and gas platforms. That industrial spine gave teeth to the threats being broadcast from Tehran. So, when Iran escalated and joined the war with the U.S. and Israel, announcing an effective closure of Hormuz and backing it with threats to fire on passing ships, it triggered a response that went far beyond protect the convoys. Washington did what it usually does first: strike visible, immediate threats. U.S. and allied forces launched Operation Epic Fury, hammering Iranian naval assets, ports, and command centers across the region with air and missile strikes. And the world saw the headlines about Iranian ships destroyed, with more than 150 naval vessels reportedly taken out, and at least 16 dedicated mine-laying ships eliminated in and around the strait. What got less attention was the second layer of the campaign: what was happening behind the coastline, deeper inside Iran's maritime ecosystem. While Iranian media triumphantly talked about controlling Hormuz, U.S. planners were asking a colder, more devastating question. What if you don't just sink the fleet? What if you crush its ability to regenerate? Instead of playing a whack-a-mole game with every fast boat and missile launcher, you go after the places where the next wave of boats would be built, repaired, and armed. That meant targeting Iran's major shipyards, marine industrial complexes, and supporting infrastructure, the very places that had allowed Tehran to sustain its asymmetric naval threat over the last 2 decades. Iran's mistake was psychological as much as strategic. Commanders were so focused on the spectacle of tankers halted at the mouth of Hormuz that they assumed the decisive battlefield was the waterway itself. They imagined the U.S. Navy as reactive, fixated on escorting ships and clearing mines. In reality, U.S. Central Command was fighting a 3-dimensional campaign. Suppress the immediate threat in the strait, yes, but simultaneously reach back into Iran's industrial heart and start amputating the limbs that would rebuild the blockade over the long term. Think of it as attacking the roots of a tree, not just pruning the branches. From the sky, key Iranian shipyards and industrial ports on the Gulf Coast looked like sprawling steel forests. Dry docks, slipways, giant cranes, stacks of steel plate, and offshore construction modules. Facilities associated with SADRA and other marine industrial outfits had become central not only to commercial shipping and oil platforms, but to Iran's ability to build, maintain, and refit vessels that could support a contested Hormuz. They were dual use, which made them both valuable and vulnerable. Precision targeting systems, satellite imagery, and signals intelligence allowed U.S. planners to map out the critical nodes inside these complexes: the dry docks housing key hulls, the heavy-lift cranes, the power substations, and the workshops where engines and propulsion systems were overhauled. Then came the blows. While the world's cameras were pointed at burning tankers and nervous convoys, waves of cruise missiles and airstrikes began landing not just on Iranian warships, but across the industrial landscape that sustained them. In one phase of the campaign, U.S. officials confirmed strikes against multiple Iranian naval headquarters and major infrastructure targets, emphasizing that the objective was to degrade Iran's military capabilities across domains, not simply sink ships one by one. The result on the ground was brutally simple. Dry docks were left flooded and twisted. Cranes that once towered over the coastline lay collapsed in the water. Workshops that produced critical components were reduced to scorched concrete slabs. To visualize what this means, imagine Iran's naval power as a fleet floating inside a giant, invisible warehouse. The world only sees what's parked at the pier or prowling the strait. The U.S. didn't just walk in and smash the cars, it blew up the warehouse, destroyed the assembly line, and cut off electricity to the entire complex. That is what it means to go after shipyards and industrial hubs instead of just chasing boats one at a time. Meanwhile, Iranian leadership tried to project composure. State media highlighted isolated successes: a tanker turned away, a foreign ship forced to submit to protocols, and the image of Hormuz as a toll booth under Tehran's sovereign control. But behind closed doors, the math was turning against them. As U.S. strikes accumulated, the number of functional naval vessels dropped sharply. With Western officials reporting that more than 150 Iranian naval assets had already been destroyed or rendered inoperable in the early weeks. Mine layers, critical to any long-term closure of the strait, were picked off aggressively. Every destroyed vessel now required dry dock space, skilled workers, specialized parts, and time. All of that depended on an industrial base that was being systematically damaged. This is where the blockade starts to eat itself. You cannot keep a grand gesture like closing Hormuz going with a shrinking, aging, unrepaired fleet. Iran could still stage selective, symbolic acts, harassing certain ships, allowing others through. But the difference between a terrifying, sustainable threat and an unstable bluff is industrial depth. By hammering the shipyards and marine industrial infrastructure, the U.S. was quietly draining that depth. Even as the strait remained dangerous, the long-term trajectories of both sides diverged. Washington could surge more ships, aircraft, and logistics into the region as needed. Tehran, by contrast, was burning through the last generation of naval assets faster than it could replace them. Globally, the consequences were brutal. The effective shutdown and selective closure of Hormuz crushed maritime traffic, sent oil prices soaring, and pushed parts of the world toward fuel rationing and industrial slowdown. But what most outside observers missed was the financial and strategic trap closing around Iran itself. By turning Hormuz into a toll booth and inviting global outrage, Tehran justified the very strikes that would cripple its own maritime industry for years. Every missile that hit a coastal shipyard was not just destroying steel, it was erasing future revenue, future shipbuilding, and future leverage. Inside Iranian command centers, the nightmare became clear when assessments started arriving from the coast. Satellite hits analyzed damage to Bushehr area marine complexes and other southern yards tied to oil and gas, ship repair, and platform construction. Engineers reported destroyed fabrication halls, damaged quays, and a growing shortage of key equipment. Even if Iran could quickly import parts or reroute some construction to smaller facilities, scaling up again to support a major, sustained naval campaign would be enormously difficult under bombardment and sanctions. The blockade that was supposed to trap the world was now trapping Iran in a future of maritime weakness. Strategically, the doctrine collapsed. For years, Iran's naval strategy relied on the idea that its geography, its long Gulf coastline and control over part of Hormuz, could offset its conventional inferiority to the U.S. Navy. Mines, missiles, and fast boats were supposed to be the great equalizer. But that only holds as long as the industrial machine behind them survives. Once the core shipyards and marine industrial centers are degraded, the equalizer fades. What remains is a navy of aging hulls, improvised fixes, and scattered workshops struggling to keep engines running under constant threat. Economically, the self-inflicted damage is even more devastating. Those shipyards, especially large players like SADRA, were not just military assets. They were engines of commercial shipbuilding, offshore energy infrastructure, and industrial employment. Their destruction ripples into Iran's ability to service its own tankers, maintain offshore platforms, and manage complex maritime projects for years. In trying to weaponize a choke point to hurt global energy flows, Tehran effectively invited a campaign that crippled a critical part of its own energy and shipping ecosystem. This is the second-wave consequence most media misses. It's not just that the U.S. destroyed ships. It's that by systematically striking Iran's shipyards and marine industrial heart, Washington turned a dramatic, made-for-TV blockade into a long-term strategic defeat. Iran can claim short-term psychological victory as oil prices spike and foreign leaders panic. But in the quiet calculus of power, the U.S. just smashed the foundation that made those threats credible over the next decade. Looking forward, this changes how every regional player reads the map. Gulf states now see in real time that attempting to hold the world hostage via Hormuz invites a level of industrial decapitation that many economies simply cannot survive. Naval warfare is no longer just about fleets colliding at sea. It is about shipyards, fabrication yards, offshore construction hubs, and the deep industrial spine that makes naval power real. The U.S. has sent a brutal message. You close the strait, we close your future. For Iran, rebuilding will be slow, expensive, and constrained. Sanctions, ongoing conflict, and the sheer scale of industrial damage mean that even partial restoration of shipbuilding and repair capacity could take many years. In that time, its navy will struggle to project the same level of credible threat in Hormuz. The blockade that once looked like a masterstroke has become a strategic boomerang. For global warfare, this episode is a warning and a preview. Choke points like Hormuz, Bab el-Mandeb, and the Malacca Strait are not just lines on a map. They are pressure valves connected directly to industrial targets on shore. Any power that tries to use them as a weapon has to consider not just the immediate gains, but the industrial retaliation that will follow. The next wars over sea lanes will be decided as much in shipyards and fabrication halls as in the narrow waters themselves. If you enjoyed this deep dive, hitting the like and subscribe button takes exactly 2 seconds and helps us expose more geopolitical realities. See you in the next briefing.